In 1800, London was a congested, unhealthy city, with the population increasing at an alarming rate. Life expectancy was low and the death rate high. Most of the city's churchyards were full or rapidly running out of space. The result? Too many deaths and too few graves. Unscrupulous vicars found grisly ways to cram bodies into overflowing graveyards so they could continue to earn burial fees, the source of most of their income. They crammed as many as 40 bodies into pits 40 feet deep. They extracted corpses from fresh graves and sold them to medical schools for inspection and dissection. Sparfield's burial ground used vast quantities of quicklime to accelerate decomposition and stuffed the remains of 75,000 bodies into a space designed to hold just 3,000. Graveyards became places of squalor, brimming with decaying body parts. Radical action was needed to rectify London's gruesome graveyards, a source of infection and disease. 100 years earlier, in 1711, architect Sir Christopher Wren suggested locating graveyards on the outskirts of London, away from packed residential areas. Wren's idea resurfaced in the early 1800s, when architects began to devise novel ways to dispose of the city's corpses. One of the most remarkable plans involved placing on the top of Primrose Hill in North London a monumental 94-storey pyramid that would stretch 950 feet into the sky and have more than 215,000 vaults able to accommodate 5 million corpses. Like other designs, this skyscraper of the dead never got off the ground. However, after a devastating cholera epidemic created an urgent need for 6,500 burial spaces in London alone, Parliament passed the Cemeteries Act that encouraged the construction of suburban cemeteries. Between 1832 and 1841, it authorised the establishment of 7 commercial cemeteries on the outskirts of London. They were modelled on Père Lachaise Cemetery, a new type of garden burial ground that opened in Paris in 1804. They were also inspired by the designs of Scottish garden designer John Claudius Loudon, who believed that cemeteries should be gardens of relaxation and recreation for the living as well as final resting places for the dead. In 1833, All Souls at Kensal Green Cemetery was the first commercial cemetery to open in London. A dissenters' chapel was completed in 1834, and a section of the cemetery was preserved for non-Anglicans to practice their own burial rites. The more impressive Anglican chapel opened in 1838, and most of the cemetery was reserved for use by members of the Church of England. Both chapels have extensive catacombs beneath their colonnades. The cemetery became an immediate success, attracting the rich and famous, including members of the royal family. Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex and son of King George III, was buried here in 1843. His sister, Princess Sophia, was entombed in this impressive sarcophagus in 1848. She never married, but may have had an illegitimate son with an equerry of her father, the king. Since 1833, Kensal Green has become the final resting place for thousands of notable people, many now interred in monuments that cost fortunes to build. The monument for Major General Sir William Casement was inspired by his time in India, when he was a member of the Indian Supreme Council and Governor-General of Bengal. The 4 statues of men supporting the roof are dressed in Bengali costumes. Though his wife and son lie here, Casement is buried in Calcutta. Herbert William Allingham was a surgeon who had many prominent patients, including King Edward VII. Allingham contracted syphilis while in surgery and then accidentally infected his wife, Alexandrina, who died from the disease in 1904. Later that year, depressed by her death, he ended his life by taking an overdose of morphine and joined her here. Circus owner and equestrian showman Andrew Ducrow designed this extraordinary Egyptian-inspired mausoleum for his wife when she died in 1835. Sculptor Robert Seaver created several monuments in the cemetery, including this beautiful representation of his wife Frances and himself. William Mulready was a London-based Irish artist and illustrator. His tomb shows him lying on a stone mat of woven straw, beneath which are carvings that depict scenes from his life. Most of the grave markers in Kensal Green are modest. Mary Hogarth was a sister-in-law of Charles Dickens, reputedly his mistress. Marigold Churchill, daughter of Sir Winston and Lady Churchill, died of septicemia a few weeks before her third birthday in 1921. One of the recent additions in the cemetery is this massive stainless steel and granite memorial garden. It's the grave of Mehdi Oliver Mehra. Mehdi died just days after his 11th birthday in 2014, having suffered fatal head injuries when he was thrown from a horse during a riding lesson. Mehdi was pen pals with children in Ethiopia, and his parents have now set up the Mehdi Oliver Foundation to help his pen pals' communities. In 1837, West Norwood was the second London cemetery to open. This splendid 40-acre cemetery has stunning architecture and some of London's most beautiful funerary monuments. Dr. Edmund Maddock was a surgeon in the Royal Navy before becoming Admiral Surgeon of the Fleet. He built the Scala Theatre in 1904 that became a venue for early film shows. Sir Henry Tate founded the Tate and Lyle Company, which developed new ways of refining sugar and invented the sugar cube. He donated his large painting collection to the nation, and it is now in London's Tate Gallery. John Wimble spent 34 years at sea and was a ship's captain with the East India Company, which had a monopoly on trading items such as cotton and opium with India. His wife, also buried here, accompanied him on his many perilous voyages. Charles Haddon Spurgeon was pastor of a Baptist congregation in London for 38 years and then left the denomination over doctrinal differences. He was a powerful orator and was known as the Prince of Preachers. He died in 1892. Henry Gallup was a partner in a New York company selling patent medicines. He went to London to set up a European branch of the business, where he met and married Lucy Renard in 1870. When she died 13 years later, Henry included her photograph, encased in a ceramic plaque on her monument, a novel practice in the 1880s. In 1842, wealthy members of London's Greek community leased a section of West Norwood Cemetery so they could establish their own Greek Orthodox necropolis. This is the imposing two-storey mausoleum of John Peter Raleigh, one of the three Raleigh brothers, who, after arriving from Greece, set up a worldwide trading network. Another brother, Stephen Raleigh, built this stunning mortuary chapel to house his son Augustus, who died of rheumatic fever while a student at Eton in 1872. The necropolis has the highest concentration of listed funerary monuments anywhere in Britain. Perched on a hill above the smoke and filth of London, Highgate Cemetery opened in 1839. The Gothic-style entrance has two chapels, one for Anglicans and one for other denominations. High perimeter walls and iron railings prevent unauthorised entry, vandalism and theft, especially body snatching. Beyond the entranceway is a colonnade and a war memorial. An elaborate Egyptian-inspired entrance leads to family vaults and a terrace of catacombs. Elizabeth Jackson was the first person buried in Highgate. She was 36 when she died on May the 26th, 1839. Thomas Sayers had the largest funeral ever seen in Highgate. He was a prize-winning bare-knuckle fighter. His dog was his constant companion in life and in death. A statue of a horse adorns the tomb of John Atchler, who died aged 22 in 1853. John's father styled himself horse slaughterer to Queen Victoria. The horse's head droops sadly. Perhaps it's contemplating its own likely fate at the hands of a knacker. The cemetery was extended in 1857. The new section's most famous resident is Karl Marx, who was a philosopher, historian and economist. Most notably, he was the founder of communism. Harry Thornton was a pianist who died in the 1918 flu pandemic. A death mask of musician and clothes designer Malcolm McLaren enhances his grave. He was the original manager of the Sex Pistols and the New York Dolls. Pop artist Patrick Caulfield designed his own simple but surprising gravestone. Abney Park was one of 3 London cemeteries opened in 1840. Its grounds were never consecrated, and it became a popular burial place for non-Anglicans. A sandstone plaque marks the grave of William and Catherine Booth, founders of the Salvation Army. Police Constable William Tyler was killed during a 6-mile chase of armed criminals who had robbed wages from a rubber factory. He was one of 7 policemen who were among the 23 killed or injured by the 2 thieves. They themselves committed suicide at the end of the pursuit. Dr. Isaac Watts was a famous nonconformist Christian minister and theologian. He wrote an estimated 750 psalms and earned the title the Father of English Hymnody. Though not buried here, this memorial was erected in 1845 and was funded by public donations. Nunhead was the second London cemetery to be opened in 1840. Unlike the other more famous cemeteries, Nunhead has relatively few famous residents, but it does have some impressive monuments. This obelisk is a memorial to 5 men who were found guilty of sedition and sent to the penal colonies in New South Wales, Australia, for advocating parliamentary reform. John Allen was a partner in a shipping firm, and he commissioned this striking granite mausoleum for his parents after they died in 1866. The monument of John Moritz Oppenheim, a wealthy skin and fur trader, has interesting, though vandalised, relief carvings in Carrara marble. He was blind during the last 20 years of his life, and this carving shows an angel touching his eyes as he lies on his deathbed in 1864. His love of art is portrayed in 2 images, a woman with brushes and a palette, and a blind man touching a sculpture of a woman's head. This gravestone inscription reveals that 4 children, none of whom were over the age of 4, were lost to the same family between 1849 and 1852. This simple memorial commemorates 9 young scouts from London's inner city slums who drowned in a boating accident during a camping and sailing trip on the Isle of Sheppey in 1912. Before Brompton Cemetery opened in 1840, it was in severe financial difficulty due to the cost of constructing its truly magnificent buildings. The original design called for 3 chapels, but only this exquisite domed building was built. In front of the chapel, between the arms of the colonnades, is a huge great circle, 300 feet in diameter, inspired by the piazza of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Beneath the colonnades lie extensive catacombs, but only 500 spaces of the many thousands of places in them were ever sold. Brompton's 205,000 graves include those of some of London's most influential reformers, including suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst. She was a prominent campaigner for women's rights for 25 years. She tragically died in 1928, just 3 weeks before reforms giving women the vote became law. Frederick Leyland was one of Britain's largest ship owners, running 25 steamships in the transatlantic trade. He was also a major art collector and patron of the arts. Hannah Peters never married, but she may have inherited a fabulous fortune from John Corthoy, an elderly merchant for whom she worked as a housekeeper. She later took his name, and he may have fathered her 3 children. John Gentleman Jackson was a bare-knuckle boxer who was crowned Champion of England in 1795. He was selected to protect George IV during his coronation in 1821. Over 300 military personnel from the 2 world wars are buried in a reserved area. Among the 13 Victoria Cross recipients buried in Brompton is Reginald Warneford, a British aviator and Royal Naval Air Service officer. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for airbombing a Zeppelin during the First World War. He died from serious injuries received when he was thrown from his aircraft after one of its wings collapsed. Tower Hamlet was the last of the Magnificent Seven Cemeteries to be launched. It opened on a 27-acre site in 1841. Though London's commercial cemeteries were designed to attract the elite and the growing middle classes, they did welcome the pennies of the poor. As it was located in a working-class neighbourhood, most of Tower Hamlet's burials were in common graves. It has relatively few eye-catching monuments. One of them is the tomb of Joseph Westwood, who ran a business that manufactured iron ships, bridges, and other iron products. Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn performed the autopsy on Mary Ann Nichols, the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Charles Brown was an ex-boxer and publican who ran the Railway Tavern, one of the most famous pubs in the East End of London. The walls of his pubs were decorated with antiques and curiosities, some of which had been brought back from around the world by his seafaring customers. Unveiled in 2016, this memorial commemorates more than 500 destitute children who were residents of Barnardo's homes and are now buried in Tower Hamlets in unmarked graves. Born in Ireland, Thomas Barnardo established his first home in London in 1868, and by the time of his death in 1905, his charity had taken in nearly 60,000 children. By 1841, 7 commercial cemeteries had been opened, and they formed a ring around London. They are now known as the Magnificent Seven. The 1830s and 40s were a golden age for commercial cemeteries, but by the 1850s, their heyday was drawing to a close. Kensal Green was probably the only commercial cemetery yielding a decent dividend for investors. As a result, only a few companies were willing to risk opening a new cemetery. One of them was the London Necropolis, now known as Brookwood Cemetery. It opened near Woking in Surrey in 1854, With 2,000 acres, it was, at the time, the largest burial ground in the world. It was located 23 miles from the centre of London, and a special train service was initiated to convey coffins and mourners from its private station in Waterloo into the cemetery. Brookwood was never as successful as its founders expected, but it still operates today. After the launch of the cemeteries, London's crowded graveyards were able to survive because they were less expensive and mourners did not have to travel to the edge of London. But their days were numbered. Another cholera outbreak in 1846 prompted the passing of a series of laws that led to the closure of city graveyards, some of which were turned into pleasant parks, while others were sold to speculators. As the graveyards were closing, publicly funded cemeteries were opening. The first was Islington and St Pancras Public Cemetery. It opened in 1854, and others followed, including Paddington, Marylebone and Hampstead. By 1900, London had 86 cemeteries. Most were publicly funded and offered landscape garden settings for some marvellous monuments. Competition from the increasing number of public cemeteries impeded the commercial cemeteries, but their success was curtailed by two other developments. Cremation was seen as an economic alternative to burials, and it became legal in 1902. It quickly became the most popular way of disposing of London's dead. Today, it accounts for more than 70% of disposals. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, attitudes to death and dying were changing. Londoners were weary of so much effort and cost being spent on elaborate funerals and flamboyant monuments. Mourning periods were reduced, and mourners visited graves less frequently. By 1900, most commercial cemeteries were struggling to survive and in a deteriorating condition. Brompton Cemetery went bankrupt just 10 years after opening, and its shareholders sold their shares to the local public authority in 1852. Burials eventually ceased in 1952. After selling most of its plots, West Norwood could not survive on maintenance fees alone, and it too was taken over by the local council. Though wealthy families continued to purchase premium plots in Highgate, most buyers opted for less expensive options. And maintenance fees slowed to a trickle as graves were abandoned by families who died out or moved away. Highgate's original section was closed in 1975. In 1966, when still only 2/3 full, Nunhead's owners locked the gates and abandoned its 300,000 silent residents. Uncared for, the cemetery was defiled by robbers and rubbish dumpers, damaged by bombs during the Second World War, and strangled by vines and dense foliage. By the 1970s, ownership of the Magnificent Seven Cemeteries had passed into the hands of local authorities. They were strapped for cash and did little to protect the cemeteries from further decay. But that's not the end of the story. The cemeteries have an afterlife. Aided by voluntary organisations and grants from the National Heritage Lottery Fund, all have undergone at least some restoration. In 1975, Southwark Council bought Nunhead Cemetery for just £1. Since then, it has cleaned up much of the cemetery and transformed it into the pleasant park we see today. Tower Hamlets is also a nature reserve, with trails and walks among its weathered monuments and gravestones. In West Norwood, the occasional interment still takes place in existing family plots. It has a crematorium and welcomes visitors to its serene landscape. Brompton is now managed by Royal Parks, which makes it Britain's only Crown cemetery. It conducts a limited number of burials each year and has a crematorium and a garden of remembrance. Like all cemeteries, Brompton has the never-ending challenge of keeping nature under control. Highgate is run by the Friends of Highgate Cemetery charity. In 2000, it received the Europa Heritage Award for conservation work on its catacombs. It continues to conduct interments, but most of its visitors come to explore its history, architecture and ecology. Kensal Green is the only one of the Magnificent Seven still privately owned. It provides burial and cremation services, and some of its buildings and monuments are being restored. Today, London's Victorian Garden cemeteries are popular destinations for tourists and local residents alike. Here, they relax in a beautiful setting, saunter among grand monuments, and inspect impressive art and architecture. They explore overgrown pathways and discover emotive inscriptions peeking out from the shrouds of dense foliage. Of course, some come to mourn. And the dead of London? They continue their serene slumber, unfazed by the boisterous metropolis that now embraces their gardens of perpetual rest.